Okay, we're going to look at the financial sector and what the financial sector focus on like financial assets, real and nominal interest rates, the measures of money, the functions of money, banking, and the money supply and how we expand it, the money market accounts, monetary policy, and loanable funds. So the first thing we're going to look at is financial assets. We see that money makes it possible for us to compare goods and services. And the interest rate really tells us that if the interest rate is high, people are not going to borrow. The lower the interest rate, the more they borrow, which leads to economic growth. And a lot of what people borrow is what money is saved, and we'll be looking at that. So the most liquid form of money is cash and what we have in our checking account, which is M1. We see M2 as other financial assets that people can put in other places, such as bonds and stocks and big time savings. And then M3 is long-term, like our retirement. We see that bonds interest rate are relatively low, but it's a solid investment compared to a stock that's depending on the stock market. The opportunity cost of holding money is the money we could, if we hold money, we give up the opportunity of earning interest on it. And so that's why a lot of people put money in investments so that they can earn something in the long run. So nominal and real interest rates. Nominal interest rate is the rate of interest at that time that is unadjusted for inflation. And we know nominal interest rates relatively are low. And so that's why I tell y'all that having a savings account is not good, because usually you're getting less than the rate of inflation. The real interest rate is what is actually the interest rate that happens that is calculated for subtracting that inflation out of it. And we did this before. Okay. So we're going to look at the functions and measures of money. So money acts as an asset and it keeps its value, and we can measure payment. So we see that money functions as a medium of exchange, that we exchange it for goods and services. It also functions as a unit account that I could look at the gas station and realize I need $1.35 for a gallon of gas. And it stores value over time. Again, we talked about this before. Would my cupcakes be a good medium of exchange? Probably not, unless people accept it. Is it a unit account? Well, I have to have several of them. Does it store value? No, it's perishable. And we did this with Welch's Warehouse. We talked about the money supply as measuring using monetary aggregate designate M1, M2. M1 is what we have on hand in our demand accounts. M2 is our long-time savings, and M3 is long run. And again, monetary policy and what banks lend out is really based on what we have in our savings. So the banking industry can increase the money supply through lending. And they organize their assets on a bank balance sheet, which we talked about this being a T-chart. Okay, and so a T-chart, I'm going to draw one out. Basically, the bank has their assets on one side, their liabilities, liabilities on the other. So their demand deposits are their liabilities, okay? Their assets are their loans and their reserves and bonds. And both sides equal each other. This side is going to equal this, okay? And we had looked at this in our T-charts. So depository institutions operate using a fractional reserve banking system. This is the reserve requirement that the government, the Fed, not the government, comes in and says that they must keep 10% of deposits. And so if we did that, if our deposit was $100 times 0.10, they have to keep $10, and they could lend out $90. And so the banks are divided into the required reserves and excess reserves. So my required reserve of my $100 deposit was $10. My excess reserve that I can now loan out is $90. Excess reserves are the basis of the expansion of the money supply. They can lend that out, but you still have title to your $100, and the next person they lend, they just created $90 too. Okay, the money multiplier is 1 over the reserve requirement, so 1 over 0.10 gives me 10. I can figure out that if the excess reserves is 90 times 10, that money supply could increase by $900. The size of the expansion of the money supply really depends on the money multiplier. The higher the money multiplier, the more the expansion. The lower it is, the less the money expansion. The maximum value of money and the money multiplier can be calculated in the reciprocal of the reserve ratio, 1 over the reserve ratio, which we just did. And we see that usually sometimes it overstates, like, yes, $900 could have been made, but sometimes the banks don't loan that out, and sometimes people don't take out all that money. Okay. What we're going to look at next is the money market. The money market is the demand and supply of money that's determined the nominal interest rate. So the money market is really when, here, let me draw it out for y'all. Here is the nominal interest rate, and the nominal interest rate is what we borrow at. Okay. And this is the quantity of money. So we know my money supply is constant. This is the money supply, and this is the demand for money. And right here where it intersects, that gives me the interest rate. This is my money market, okay? Okay, so the demand for money shows an inverse relationship, which is downward sloping. So the lower the interest rate, the more people want to borrow money. Okay, if that interest rate is high, people don't want it. So the monetary policy basically determines by the central bank what will happen here. So if the government, if the Fed increases the money supply, that lowers that interest rate. If they increase the interest rate, decrease the money supply, that higher the interest rate. And less people are going to borrow over here, more people will borrow over here. Okay. We're going to see that really affects by our monetary policy. So we are going to look at monetary policy and the Fed implementing policy to achieve economic goals such as price stability. We see that they use open market operations of buying and selling of bonds, required reserves, which we just did in the banking system, and the discount rate. The most frequent use is open market operations when the buying of bonds and securities. The central bank will conduct either the sale of the open market operations, bonds and securities. They decrease or increase the reserve requirement, and it affects our money supply. And so what we're going to look at is how the Fed really looks at our state of the economy and how it affects our lending practices. So I'm going to look at this chart over here. So we know over here we are in the phase of an expansion. And we know that we have our problem is demand, pull, inflation. Okay, so there's too much dollars out there, so the money supply needs to be reduced. And so the Fed, what they're going to implement to tighten the money supply is contractionary, or I call it tight. That was my nickname for it. Monetary policy. What that will do is they're going to increase the reserve requirement. They're going to sell OMOs, because they sell them, they bring in that money, and they're going to increase the discount rate. All of this will impact our money market. So here's the interest rate, the quantity of money. Here's the money supply. Now here's the demand for money, right? That interest rate was low. Now there's less money, so this money supply curve moves that way, and thus the interest rate went up. So then there's less money being loaned out. It kind of stagnates our economy. We're now going to look at this phase of the business cycle. Over here, this phase, we're in an expansion. And our problem is unemployment. Not enough people working, so the government solution is they need to increase the money supply. the Fed's solution. So what they're going to do is expansionary fiscal policy. What they're going to do, I always think down, boy, down, they're going to decrease the reserve requirement. They're going to buy. When they buy, they give money out and they take the paper away. OMOs. And they're going to decrease the discount rate. And so when they do this, now here's my graph. This is the interest rate. This is the quantity of money. Now this is the money supply. Now there's more money that could be lent out. This money supply moves this way, and so the interest rate goes down. And now more people are out to borrow. Okay, so we kind of went over that. Okay, and we kind of did the loanable funds with that one as well. How when the government comes in and increases the money supply, it makes more loanable funds available. Okay, guys, we've done this, and we got one more. Bye.